In England, we're incredibly lucky to be surrounded by historic buildings. I actually used to walk past an Anglo-Saxon tower on my way to get sandwiches at lunchtime when I was studying in Oxford. Many of these also have associated stories. Less fortunately, some of these stories aren't strictly true. Today's guest, James Wright, has made a career in sorting the truth from the fiction, and he's here today to talk about his new book. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another one of my podcasts. I've got a guest I'm particularly excited about today. We're going to be talking about medieval myth busting. James Wright, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jason, for having me on the podcast. It's a real privilege. I'm a buildings archaeologist, so I study historic standing buildings. I've looked at stuff from the 11th century all the way through to the 20th century, but mostly these days I concentrate on medieval and early modern, which is 16th and 17th century buildings. And I've been doing this for about 25 years or thereabouts, on and off. And I can be found working all over the country, looking at really interesting old structures, often helping people with their planning applications or conservation projects. And to be honest with you, most of my work these days is just assisting people who want to find out more about the buildings that they live or work in, or community projects, that kind of thing. So it's quite a nice career, really, because it takes me all over the country and gives me the opportunity to get to see the inside of lots of private historic buildings.
Well, I'm going to start with an interesting one, because the idea of helping people with planning, this is for planning for listed buildings. For those that don't know, buildings in the UK can be sort of officially listed, and therefore it limits what you can and can't do. So are you going in there to sort of try and advise people on correct building methods and that kind of thing, or is it much broader than that?
I sometimes make advisory comments, but mostly actually I'm reacting to local planning authorities, essentially councils or Historic England, the curators of listed buildings, when they actually give the go-ahead for works to happen. And that can be remodeling, alterations, conservation, that kind of thing. There's a legal requirement to make a record of the building before you start construction work. And that's very much what I do. There's various levels of records, and I come in and I do the field work. I make a survey of the building. I make my observations of its form, its function, its setting, its context, its dating and phasing, and its history as well, and capture all of that data using notes and annotations, using drawings, using photography, and then produce all of that as an analysis of the building. So that's, broadly speaking, buildings archaeology in a nutshell. We do archival research, but much of our work is looking at the building itself and allowing the structure to speak to us rather than chasing through the archives.
Well, before we get on to the sort of medieval myth busting stuff and your book, have you had any incredible surprises when you've been doing that? Do you sort of pop along somebody's house and think, yeah, it's probably 16th century, it's fairly old by most standards, but it's nothing special, and then you kind of uncover it and you go, okay, this is a bit more special than we thought. Or perhaps the opposite. So now you do a thing on pubs, and pubs are often claiming to be the oldest pub in England and all that kind of thing. So have you come across, without naming names obviously or getting anybody into trouble, have you come across those slightly awkward moments where you've gone, yeah, we've got something different here?
Well, one of the joys of this is that with private buildings, with domestic residences, quite often the date of the structure is a little bit up for question. So a lot of the listed descriptions are often a little bit inaccurate, and they tend to be on the conservative side of things. So I reckon probably more than half of the times when I open that front door and go into these buildings, that the structure is actually quite a bit older than the client actually knew. The story I tell quite frequently is of pulling up in a taxi outside a house in Warwickshire and me having to tap the driver on the shoulder and say, "Oi, mate, have you got the right house here?" Because I was under the impression that this was going to be some sort of amazing timber frame building. But from the outside, it just looked like a Victorian place. It was all rendered over on the outside. It had this little nice arts and crafts porch, but it looked like nothing at all. It was an unlisted building. And then the door opened and I kind of fell into late 15th, early 16th century, something like that.
Wow.
Because you just wouldn't know from the outside at all that this was an intact timber framed building. And that's why it hadn't been listed. Because when the listing inspectors came round, they looked at it from the street frontage and thought, it's probably 1880s, 1890s. Those are two a penny. It's not a particularly great example of one of those. It's not built by a known architect. We'll just move on and go and look at the more interesting buildings in the village. So yeah, that does definitely happen. We'll talk, I'm sure, about pubs in a bit more detail, but it's often the reverse with pubs. The licensees will be claiming that the structure is 5 centuries older than it actually is. And it's the complete reverse there.
Right. Well, let's talk about that because, pubs are an interesting thing. Obviously, the whole point of a pub is to get people in and sell them booze. And that's a noble pursuit that's been done since, well, I guess the Romans had more or less pubs and tavernas. So people have been trying to attract clientele. And I suppose claiming your pub dates back to the Crusades or claiming your pub dates back to the founding of Rome or whatever is a long tradition. So take us on that journey a bit because you probably disappointed more than a handful of publicans. You're not on a pub hit list, are you? Are you barred for any pub?
I'm not barred from any of them yet. You mentioned pubs which claim to date to the Crusades. Well, about a mile or so from where I'm sat here in Nottingham is, of course, Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem, which is one of the claimants to be the oldest in the country. It's got the famous painted signage on the white brick walls which says 1189 AD, the oldest inn in England. And the story that's presented on various signs around the building in books and all over the internet is that this was the place where crusaders met to have a pint before they popped off to the Holy Land with Richard I. And, the Trip's a great place. It's a pub that I used to work in the late 90s. It's a pub that I still drink in. And I've written about it quite extensively. It is a historic building, but it's nowhere near as old as it's claimed. So the claim is 1189 and it's to do with crusaders meeting. That's why it's called a trip to Jerusalem. Trip as in journey. But the building itself is late 17th century. The famous caves which the building abuts are also 17th century because that whole area of the brewhouse yard in Nottingham was cut back in about 1600s.
Just for other people, so Nottingham Castle is a lump of rock,
Yeah.
and this is towards the bottom of the lump of rock, and there's a big cliff. And then on the top of the cliff there are slightly disappointing remains of Nottingham Castle, home potentially of the eponymous Sheriff of Nottingham, or again, is that probably a myth?
Nottingham Castle was a royal castle. It was one of the most important royal castles in the Midlands. It acted as a kind of a bridge between the north and the south. So lots of sort of military campaigns pass through Nottingham. Lots of government decisions are made there. And of course, it's famous for its connections with Robin Hood. And yes, the Trip is built into the caves at the bottom there, in what was once the brewhouse yard, an external service courtyard to the castle, which was accessed by a very interesting 98-metre long service passage, which is burrowed through the rock. So it's a fantastic area.
Yeah.
But the story that this is a 12th century pub is somewhat... well, it's on dodgy foundations, to be honest with you, because it's a 17th century building. The caves are 17th century. And then there's later additions to it. The earliest reference to a pub there is 1751, and it became the Trip to Jerusalem in 1799. So all of the stories that are told of this fantastic building are much later. Now, I've tried to look into this and to explain the development of this story, and somehow have not managed to get myself barred there. I had a lovely conversation just before the publication of my book, Historic Building Myth Busting, which kind of looks into these claims which are made about historic buildings. Just before that came out, I ran into the landlord, Carl, and we had a lovely 20-minute conversation, and he's got a really good sense of humour about this sort of debunking. And, I think he still sees it as good for business. But ultimately, that's what that story is all about. It's a kind of very marketing-driven decision to actually present the building as 12th century. That occurred during the early years of the 20th century, when the landlord of the pub, George Ward, realised that the adjacent public house, the Gate Hangs Well, was about to be demolished. This was a much bigger public house. That was demolished. All of a sudden, there's better views of the trip from the road for visitors. And so George thinks, wonderful advertising opportunity here. We'll paint the signage on there. We'll claim to be 12th century. And he starts handing out business cards which have the famous Crusader myth printed on them. And his source just very loosely says, according to old historical books. But of course, those books have never come to light. So what I tend to do with the pub myths, but also with all of the other stories that I look at in the book, is to try and get the story behind the stories. So I'm not just interested in the straightforward debunking, namely that the trip to Jerusalem isn't 12th century, it's 17th century and became a pub in the 18th century. We could stop there, but I always go one step further to try and get under the skin of those stories, to understand the folklore. And that's really, for me, the joy, what that tells us about the communities that tell these stories. Now, in the case of pubs, it's quite often a marketing drive that's got a little bit out of hand.
Well, I love that because it's actually the history of the myth that you're looking at. And sometimes these things dwindle and the myth goes away, and other times it gets built on and reinforced. And then you've got sort of people who know it's not, but does it matter? And then the fact that we're talking about it probably means a few people who are going Nottingham are going to go and have a look at this pub and going to sell some beer. So it comes back to rude commerce at the end of the day. But I also love it because throughout history, there have been tales told by people who are creative. There might be creative speakers, and they tell a story about their client, and it might be a king or a famous noble, and they tell these stories, and then they realize the audience likes that particular bit, so they emphasize that bit. And before you know it, after 10 years, the story has grown, and even the people involved in it are slightly unfamiliar with that story. It's like not quite how it happened, but it's a better story than the way it happened. Or sometimes the reality doesn't quite finish in a good way, and it's a better story if you tweak the ending to be the way that we want the story to end. I was going to come back to your pursuit of myth busting, and how do you actually set about sort of identifying a myth that's worthy of investigation and then sort of digging into it and trying to find the truth? Because sometimes it might be deliberately obscured, I would have thought, or hidden for political reasons or whatever that might be.
Well, some of the myths that I look at are not just claims to be the oldest pub in the country. I look at stories such as there being historic buildings which incorporate reclaimed timbers which have come from famous warships from the Spanish Armada or the Battle of Trafalgar or similar. I look at very widespread stories of secret passages riddling the landscape, subterranean landscapes. I look at the old story that all castle spiral staircases turn clockwise to advantage right-handed defenders. These are all tales which are told about buildings, but you can essentially approach them in a very forensic methodology using buildings archaeology, which is my chosen career for the last quarter of a century. And we would do that in three ways, and we can approach any story about any building in this manner. So firstly, we can do the basics. We can go and look at what's in the archival records. So we can look at maps and plans, documents, newspaper articles, diaries, whatever there is, primary sources which inform the history of the building. Now, with the structures that I look at, that's likely to only take you back so far. So with me looking at medieval and early modern buildings, the documents can often be quite thin. And I draw attention to Warkworth Castle in Northumberland, which is one of the most famous castles. It's a flagship site for English heritage. It is one of the castles of the Percy families, one of the principal northern medieval families. And there's this great big tower on the Mott there that's a massive architectural focus. And yet nobody's quite sure how old it is. Some people think it's 14th, 15th or 16th century. Now, personally, architecturally, I think it's the earlier end of that, but there are people who disagree with me. So if a structure as old and as important as the Great Tower at Warkworth Castle can have uncertainties about its age, you can kind of see how stories and myths and rumour can actually percolate into much smaller, less significant buildings, and how the archival record can let us down, because essentially the Percy archives do not exist for the building accounts of Warkworth Castle. So the archival record is a little bit wobbly, sometimes a little bit woolly. So as a result, we use the archaeology of the building. Now that's the material culture. That is what the physical fabric tells you. And you can use parallels with other buildings in the locale. You can use stylistic dating. But again, it comes down to making those observations about the structure that I was alluding to right at the beginning of our chat, and capturing that data and analysing it. Sometimes we will also be able to throw in a little bit of dendrochronology, so scientific tree ring dating, to try and understand the genesis, the origin of these buildings as well. So using that kind of triple pronged approach, we can start to get at the truth of this. Now, it's not always how old is that building. Sometimes the stories are a little bit more complicated, such as, is there a secret passage there? But again, if you're actually looking at the physical structure, you can go down into the cellars, you can look at it, you can try and understand, is there a tunnel coming from this building? And, you know, that is certainly one of the things which I occasionally do. I was in Newark yesterday in a cafe, and the people that work there found out what I did for a living, and they wanted to take me into the cellars because they were absolutely certain that there were secret passages running out from this particular building. And I looked at it, and what I saw was a coal hole.
Right, yes.
But there's often these sparks to people's imaginations.
And in a way, that's why a lot of people get involved in history, because there is a romance to thinking that there's a secret tunnel. And in my experience, there's often a slightly salacious story about tunnels, especially on coastal places. And these do exist. You know, there are smuggler tunnels or smuggler caves, which genuinely do exist, I believe. But often you find the Knights Templars are involved in tunnels, in my experience, and often secret mistresses and sort of illicit pursuits of monks leaving the grounds to go and pursue sin and gluttony in other places. And I think as human beings, we love those kind of stories. You know, a secret passage is great and sounds very romantic, but if it's got a sort of slightly dodgy connection to something that we all also love, it sort of adds to it.
Yeah, you're absolutely bob on with that observation, to be honest with you, because one of the things that I spotted with years of looking at secret passages is that, as you say, there is this kind of whiff of the nefarious, this aspect of scandal and skullduggery and secretiveness about them. Well, why did they need something which was secret and hidden? Well, there must be as you say, a dodgy reason for that. And one of the things which I found in the stories that's a very common thread that runs between the tales is that at one or both ends of these tunnels in the storytelling, there will be a Catholic building.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's very, very, very common. And it might be that the church is linked to the local pub,
Right.
or that the monastery is linked to the nunnery, or that the cathedral is linked to the brothel.
Right.
And a lot of these stories are to do with drink and sex. So think about the context of medieval clerics, Catholic clerics, monks, priests, etc. Think about the context of this when the Reformation comes along. There is an active government-sponsored propaganda to trash and tarnish the reputations.
Oh, so is this early disinformation, do you think? It's tied in with anti-Catholic propaganda?
I don't necessarily think that the secret passage rumours are dreamed up deliberately. I think they come a little bit later, because you've got that kind of romantic thinking that comes along a bit later with the kind of forgetfulness of the Catholic moment, the misinterpretation of buildings. Not everybody is a buildings nerd. Not everybody spent 25 years rummaging around in these structures, and a blocked door in a structure can quite easily lead to rumours about, well, where does that door go? Well, it leads into a passage that goes 3 miles across the landscape to the local lord of the manor's house, and it was how he snuck into the nunnery to have it away with the abbess or something like that. So this idea then that the monks and nuns and priests were essentially all horny drunks grows up in the telling, because by the 16th, 17th, 18th century, you've got this suspicion of Catholicism, this idea that they are the enemy within, that the Pope in Rome is setting up his hellish minions to actually bring down the Church of England, and everybody as part of their patriotism will have this suspicion of Catholicism. And you think about Catholic plots, particularly in the later 16th and very early 17th century, you can see how that paranoia might lead to stories about underground passages used by Catholics.
There were genuine plots. I mean, the gunpowder plot is all about that, and you literally do have priest holes.
Yeah.
So they genuinely exist. So you can easily see how somebody could extend those things that genuinely do exist into other areas and sort of old passages, which were just convenient kind of ways of cutting across something, or even sewage or whatever it might be, or water,
Mm-hmm.
can become sort of co-opted into those stories. But there's another one I wanted to ask you about, which I haven't heard recently, which is the sort of mysterious room that you can't get into in a stately home, where the misborn offspring of the nobility are sort of entombed, and this idea that house guests would go and put a towel out of each window in this stately home, and there'd be one window which nobody could find the entrance to the room. Is that a myth you've explored, or is that a more modern Gothic?
It's not one that I've explored myself. I tend to look at the earlier stories connected to the medieval and early modern period. That sort of sounds like one that's coming along in the 18th, 19th century.
Yes, yeah.
But there are references to that kind of activity, certainly in my friend Mark Norman's Folklore of Devon book, where he looks at the mythology, the folklore of the blocked off room. And often, again, as you say, there can be a bit of a dark turn to that, where somebody's been walled in there. Often there's talk of nuns being walled up, or, as you say, bastards being walled up, or the like. So that's something which my friend and colleague has looked into, but it's not something that quite attracted me. It's almost veering into ghost folklore there, really, because often the blocked off room is therefore the source of the person who died in this room, and then they're heard wailing through the walls of an evening. And I've kind of sheared away from kind of paranormal stories as much as I possibly can do. It's just almost like a bridge too far for me. I have written a few things about buildings which do have kind of paranormal stories attached to them, but I'm more drawing it back to the kind of what you might call invented histories, which then predicate the ghost stories, because there is an unfortunate aspect of some of the paranormal organizations that they want to make a macabre, overly spooky, arcane and esoteric history for the building, which will then draw in the punters. So there's quite a few what I would call invented histories, and I don't want to mention any particular names here, but there are one or two buildings which, a bit like the pubs, when you actually look at their historical background, inverted commas, you find that it is all invented and it's there as another marketing drive. So I've tended to sheer away from that, particularly in the book, although I have written a couple of blogs sort of questioning that more recently.
Well, let's go back to the medieval then, because I'm obviously fascinated. My YouTube channel, I look at lots of myths, and not myths as much, but sort of I try to look at what people would perceive as the medieval, and in fact, it's just wrong. So you talked about castle staircases. I mean, there's an obvious way of debunking that by going to look at castle staircases and seeing which way they go round, I guess. That's the most obvious scientific analysis.
Yeah. So the castle staircase story is so popular. And for most people who, again, are not castles nerds, my PhD is in castle studies, so I've taken it to extremes, really. But most people, they go to castles on a Sunday afternoon. It's a National Trust property, an English Heritage property, Cadw property, and they go and have a look round, and it's somewhere nice to have a picnic, maybe have a cup of coffee in the cafe, something like that. They're not really taking in the minutiae of the architecture or the history of it. They're maybe having a brief glance at an interpretation panel and possibly reading a bit of the guidebook. But for most people, it's just a nice backdrop for a nice day out, really. But the one thing that most people, and again, inverted commas, know about castles is that all spiral staircases turn clockwise. And the idea is that this is part of the defensive mechanism of the castle, because the right-handed attacker going up the stairs will have their sword arm impeded by the column that runs up the centre of the staircase, whereas the guy who's fighting downhill will have a much better swing and so has the advantage. And it's predicated on this idea that castles are military defensive fortifications. And that kind of reinforces what most people think about castles, that they're forts. So, of course, even the staircase is going to be defensive in nature. And that comes out of the thinking of the Victorian world. The early castle specialists were military men. People like Viollet-le-Duc, General Pitt Rivers over in this country. Reginald Brown had a glittering career in the Second World War. Philip Warner was a lecturer at the Royal Military Academy. So there's these men with military backgrounds. And for really about 100 years, from the late 19th century to the later 20th century, that is the orthodoxy, that these are primarily fortifications. And it's kind of based on a Victorian and early 20th century world, which is obsessed with military conquest and empire. So they look at what they've got, their scientific forts of those periods, and they project that back to the medieval. Well, of course, they must be forts as well. And then starting in the very late 70s, early 80s, you start to get people questioning this. People like Charles Coulson, Paul Everson, they're questioning this. They're saying, well, are they really primarily forts? And gradually there's a snowball effect. And by the later 90s, early 2000s, which is kind of when my career starts, there's been a complete revision. And the orthodoxy has changed entirely, that these are much more complicated buildings that are not just forts. They're not just residences. They offer an economic aspect. There is a religious context to them. There's landscapes of lordship, which are looking both in and out of castles. There's just so much going on regarding pageantry and theatrical ceremony. There's a ritual context. There's a poetical context. There's gardens and landscape design. So much going on, so much diversity in castle studies. And yes, these buildings do have some security because they are the treasure houses of the powerful and the mighty. But the security, the defensive aspect, had been rather overstated. And as Robert Lydiard pointed out, this is an academic from the University of East Anglia, he points out that the military record of castles is bloody appalling. And he draws attention in his book to Hampshire, where there were 26 sieges and castles fell 22 times. That's an 85% failure rate. If these are being designed as forts, then they're being designed very, very badly indeed. And so all of a sudden we kind of get over the hill and we start looking at castles differently. And the old spiral staircase story no longer seems as safe as it once did do, especially as you've got specialists like Neil Guy of the Castle Studies Group and Charles Ryder from the University of Chester, who started looking at big data and analysing the surviving medieval spiral staircases in castles. And they found, independently of each other, that 30% of castle staircases go the other way. So they go anti-clockwise. Now that's what you would call a substantial minority in statistics.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, that falls down. Why are so many of them going the other way if they are genuinely fortified structures? And then you start getting experimental archaeology and reenactors looking at this. And they're kind of saying, well, actually, if you stood on a spiral staircase, you don't want to be swinging and slashing because you haven't got room.
Yeah.
They're really narrow. So what you want, if you really are fighting, is a short stabbing weapon because that's all you've got room for. But by the way, they say, the guy who's uphill fighting downwards is at a disadvantage because he's overbalancing to get at the guy who's lower. Meanwhile, the guy downhill has got access to the other fellas, ankles, lower legs and nether regions.
Yes.
Ultimately, he's got the advantage. But moreover, we've got absolutely no evidence for a fight on a spiral staircase at any point during the medieval period anywhere.
Right.
It's just not there in the records. But because people have seen it in The Adventures of Robin Hood in 1938 with Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone having this set-piece sword fight in a Hollywood movie, they're kind of given license to think, well, this did actually happen. But it didn't. So we've got all sorts of problems, but the real smoking gun And this is the bit that really surprised me in the research for this. And I never thought I'd get to the opportunity to discover something like this. The real smoking gun with the story is that it was invented in 1902 by an art critic.
Oh, so we actually know the origin of this.
Yeah, he was an art critic called Theodore Cook, comes out of that Victorian world, published a book called Spirals in Nature and Art. So there's your first red flag. This is a man who's obsessed with spirals.
Yeah.
You look at his biography, and throughout his writing, he's really obsessed with left-handedness. He thought that left-handers excelled at whatever they did. So here's a man who's talking about Hans Holbein, Leonardo da Vinci, and other people that he considered to be left-handed. And then he goes on this big, long digression about a couple of really obscure Franco-Germanic fencers called Alphonse Kirchhofer and Louis Marignac. And you like sort of scratching your head going, well, I get that da Vinci and Holbein are interesting characters, but why they had such a brief mention? And these two obscure fencers are getting page and reams written about them. And then you look at the other aspect of Cook's life, and he was just a fencing nut. That's all he wanted to do with his life. He founded Oxford University's fencing club. He was the fencing columnist for the Telegraph. He was on the Amateur Fencing Association's committee, and he picked British Olympic fencers as well. So you put those things together in a biography, a man who's obsessed with spirals, a man who's obsessed with left-handedness, and a man who's obsessed with sword fighting. And really, only he could invent this. And if anybody else did invent this, then they had absolutely no impact at all. Because from the moment of Cook's book, which was actually published in 1903, but he published an essay which included the myth in 1902. From that moment, other people start quoting him, and they all go back to Cook as the originator of the story. And then eventually a castle specialist called Sidney Toy includes it in a book that he published just before the war and then was reformulated just after the war. And Toy sold big, major units.
What's particularly interesting is it's quite a compelling narrative. There's a certain amount of logic to it. There's a bit of gruesomeness. You're going back to the medieval world that everybody's fighting all the time and stabbing each other and slashing each other to death. And it's sort of quite lurid. Again, back to the tales of monks and nuns escaping and fornicating. This is also quite visually fun in that you go to this beautiful stately home, this castle, and you're climbing up the narrow spiral staircases. They're quite a chore to climb up sometimes. They're very steep, very different to modern staircases. And the idea that people were fighting in them is sort of quite exciting and romantic. And so I think probably the reason these ideas stick is because A, they don't do much harm, although maybe we can come on to that. Maybe they do harm, but they're fun and they're visual. And it's a sort of thing, as a dad, you want to tell your kids.
Yeah, very much so. And that aspect of the father to the son or the grandfather to the grandson is a really important part of the communication of these stories. And in particular, the spiral staircase story.
Right.
Anecdotally, it is a boy's story. And I know I've met 2 or 3 women who claim to have told this story, but mostly when I ask my audiences who has told this story, when they do admit it, it's kind of 99% of the people who put their hands up are men, and they're older men as well. And when you get into it, it's older men who've relayed it to younger kids. And it's that kind of aspect that it takes hold, because you can't possibly imagine that Grandad might have told you something which was untrue.
Right.
So you're emotionally attached to the story. And when I kind of found some writing by a couple of American sociologists called Chip and Dan Heath about the nature of urban myths and why stories stick and why people believe the unbelievable and why urban myths in particular are so popular, they point out that the most important aspect of the storytelling is to tug on the heartstrings, to make the story emotional. And if you can do that, you're already more than halfway there with people believing you. There's several things that they say, but the other really important thing is to make the story short and snappy and self-contained. That's why the debunking is always so difficult to communicate, because it takes time. It's complex. I probably spoke to you for getting on for 5 minutes without taking a breath just now. It takes a while, whereas the story of the spiral staircase myth can be relayed in really under 5 seconds. And it sounds plausible, and you're emotionally invested if your granddad's told it to you. And I'll be honest with you, it's bloody popular.
Yeah.
So you can find it anywhere you want, in books and magazines and newspapers, TV documentaries, radio broadcasts, podcasts. There was a very, very well-known British social media historian who put this out recently, was debunked thoroughly, but failed to respond to any of the debunkers. So, there's people who are not exactly helping the cause here that should know better, but it generates good clicks. And again, anecdotally, I stood at the bottom of the staircase in Mortimer's Tower at Ludlow Castle in 2022, and I was waiting for the space to clear so I could take some photograph of the old gate vaulting in there. And while I was stood there, I overheard the spiral staircase myth repeated 6 times in under 5 minutes. That's how popular it is. And this wasn't even a busy day.
Right.
So it's really difficult to dislodge that one.
Well, I had one that was vaguely interesting. I was in Wales doing a kind of knight in his horse demonstration. I'd taken Warlord, one of my horses, down there. I was in full armour. I was talking to kids about knights in armour. And there was a school, lots of school trips. And a school teacher came along with their kids and all terribly excited to meet a real knight in inverted commas. And I explained I wasn't a real knight. I was pretending to be a knight, but this was real armour and a real horse. And the teacher carefully and supportively explained to the children that a knight in armour can't get on his horse off the ground. And I said, well, I'll just show you.
Yeah.
So I got on Warlord on the ground and then got off again. And, it's a little awkward, and you have to know what you're doing. And it is definitely harder to get on a horse off the ground in armour than without armour. You're wearing multiple kilos of steel. So, of course, it's going to be harder. But you can do it. And I said, there you go. And he said, yeah, and knights can't get on their horse when they're in armour. And I've literally just shown you. And he sort of looked at me as if I'd somehow undermined his authority, which I guess in some ways I had.
Yeah, but I think you did the right thing, because one of the things I have spotted with the communication of these myths as well is that one of the reasons they are believed is because they are often spoken of or written by figures of authority, and that includes the teacher. One of the myths that I look at in the book is of ship timbers. I mentioned this at the beginning. And one of the quotes that I managed to harvest from social media was of somebody who told me that their teacher at school had said that their school buildings were made from ship timbers. Now, I looked into the building in question, and it definitely wasn't the case. But because the teacher had told the children, well, why would you disbelieve your teacher? They're there, they're knowledgeable. Their job is literally to communicate fact to you. So for them to be wrong was almost unfeasible. And again, it's the same idea as the grandfather or the father, the figure of authority. And there are all sorts of authority figures, whether they are Victorian antiquarians or the local historian in your village. The museum curator can sometimes get things wrong. Church wardens tell some cracking stories which are not based on truth. And then it kind of rolls on. I'll be honest with you, one of the biggest figures of authority that just get it wrong repeatedly are the mainstream media. So many stories in newspapers and online outlets immediately go for the arcane, the esoteric and the macabre, or the violent or the spooky, rather than the fact that is staring you in the face. So if we go back to secret passages, in 2021, the BBC reported the discovery of a secret medieval tunnel in the valley just up from Tintern Abbey in Monmouthshire. And they'd gone straight hard in on secret medieval tunnel in their headline. And it took me about 25 minutes to work out what was going on there. So I didn't have to spend hours researching this or days researching it. There was a genuine underground space which had been discovered. It was during some works by Western Power Distribution. They'd been doing some digging down by the river, and they'd gone into a stone-lined linear structure. And I managed to find a published article which basically spoke of an intensive amount of industry in the 18th and 19th centuries in this particular valley, which was largely geared towards iron smelting and also the manufacture of wire. And there was a couple of wire making mills very close to this feature. And in this article, the authors had said, well, we know that this was water powered, but we don't know how they got the water to the mill. We can't actually see where that was. Well, clearly we now know, because what Western Power Distribution discovered was a water conduit, an underground water conduit, which is a perfectly normal, regular thing to build during the Industrial Revolution. But no, because it was close to a medieval abbey, made famous as a result of the Wordsworth poem, so it's in the public consciousness, and because we know that monks have underground tunnels, the BBC went straight for secret medieval tunnel. Figure of authority. Why would you disbelieve them? Of course they fact-checked it. No, they haven't. They just want clicks on the website.
Well, yes, and I've also noticed sometimes if you consume media at the weekend, it tends to be potentially a bit more salacious. And I wondered whether the sort of weekend crew are a bit younger, less experienced, or more keen to make their name with lots of clicks, perhaps.
Wow, I'm glad somebody else has spotted this. I haven't necessarily spotted that in terms of the journalists, but I must look at that now, because what I have spotted is that I get more pushback from people against the myth busting and the debunking at weekends. And this is particularly true of Saturday mornings.
Right.
Because I think that people have just got a bit more time. They're a bit more relaxed. They can spend a bit more time communicating on social media. And possibly people who are not online in the week come online on a Saturday morning. And I get some proper vitriol thrown at me on Saturday mornings.
I was going to ask, you get sort of like almost people being abusive because you're spoiling their story and they're quite emotionally attached to it.
Yeah, I really genuinely do. It's never quite gone to the extent of death threats yet,
Right.
but there have been people who've got either massively obsessive and are bombarding me with comments. Some people who go rummaging around the internet to find my other social media profiles, because sometimes it gets a little bit worrying and you're just a bit like, this person's a little bit obsessed. So it might be discreet to just stop responding to them. And on occasion, I might even have to block somebody. So, there are some people that can get a little bit obsessed with it. Going back to the pub situation. So there's about 24 pubs in the country which claim to be the oldest. They can't all be right. And what I've noticed is that there's a fairly even spread across the country. Most regions have got one. So in the East Midlands, of course, it's the trip to Jerusalem. In the kind of fenlands of East Anglia, it's the old ferry boat at Holywell. In the home counties, it's the Fighting Cocks in St Albans. So there's an even spread. And what I've found, whenever we talk about the oldest pub story on the internet, is that I will be just bombarded by people telling me that their local is the oldest. So it's never like a Yorkshireman claiming it's this one in Lancashire or vice versa. It's always the one that's nearest them, and they want to believe that. And again, it's this emotional investment. It's the pride that it's the one you've been to. It's the one that you know about that is the oldest. And I got into this protracted ding-dong with another stonemason, actually, called Philip. And Philip wouldn't let go. He was determined that the Bingley Arms in West Yorkshire, in a little village called Bardsey, was definitely the oldest pub in the country. And Philip was giving me all sorts of bizarre commentary along the lines of, well, of course it dates to the 10th century. It's obvious. You've only got to be in there to just look around and just sense that it's 10th century and date. And I was sort of saying that that's not quite how this works, and saying it's actually an 18th century building. And he was saying, well, you haven't even been there. You haven't had a pint in there. And I was like, well, I have had a pint in there. Well, show us a photograph of you in there. Well, I didn't take a photograph. It was sort of before digital photography was readily available. Oh, you haven't been in there. If you'd been in the oldest pub in the country, you would have taken a photograph. And I was like, well, it's not the oldest pub in the country. And this became this very circular argument. And then about a week later, there was another fella, and he was from Lancashire, also called Philip. And he became obsessed with the Old Man and Scythe in Bolton being the oldest. Now, their claim is that they date to the 1250s and that the pub is mentioned in the market charter for the town. Now, I've read the market charter and there's no mention of any pubs, including the Old Man and Scythe. In reality, the pub is a mid-17th century structure that was probably open as a pub by the 1770s, something like that. But again, Philip of Lancashire wouldn't let go. So you've got this Yorkshireman and Lancashireman, and the Wars of the Roses are being fought via me as a conduit for the oldest pub in the country. Anyway, so the Phillips are some of my favourite people because I've got great quotes from them. I quote them anonymously and I speak about them quite a bit, but the Phillips are quite important in sort of diffusing this. And I sometimes think it's important to have a sense of humour about this, because if you do take it all too seriously, you can end up down some really weird internet wormholes and you can end up taking yourself too seriously. So I do think it's important to inject a bit of humour into it, to just try and diffuse and satirise and maybe even turn the whole debate into a bit of a burlesque, to be honest with you, because it is quite ludicrous when you actually think of it. There's 24 pubs. They all claim to be the oldest, and hilariously, not one of them is the oldest.
So is there an oldest pub as far as you're concerned? Is that known? Or I suppose the simple answer is there are lots of pubs, and some of them could be very old and just haven't claimed it yet. Is there one to your knowledge, or are you going to keep that secret?
No, because I've published it in the book. It's been out in the world for nearly 3 months now.
Okay.
So what I had to do in this chapter, once I'd finished debunking what I call the usual suspects, the Bingley Arms, the Old Man Inside the Trip, the Old Ferry Boat, the Fighting Cocks, etc., which just come up on the internet all the time. Once I'd finished debunking all of their claims, I then started looking at, well, what do we actually have? What is actually out there? And what could we call a pub? And there's all sorts of variables that you kind of have to go through. Now, I've explained how buildings archaeology works already, so I won't repeat myself there. But in terms of pub history, there's broadly speaking 3 variables. So there are pubs which started off life. They were purpose-built as pubs. They had a long and illustrious career, and then they closed, and those buildings now do something else. Now, a good example of that might be somewhere like the New Inn at Oxford, which was founded in the 1380s, but the last pub on the site closed in the early 1900s, and it's now shops and cafes. So that's that version. There are some buildings which started off as domestic houses, became a pub for a period of time, and then turned back into something else like a domestic house. The White Horse at Sybil Headingham works in that way. It's a late 15th century building, converted into a pub by 1790, but closed for business in 2012 and is now a private house. It's one of the buildings that I've surveyed. And then, this is the most important and significant type of pub. They were built as pubs, they've always been pubs, and they are still pubs. And I can only find about 12 or 15 of those which predate the year 1500. What you might call the genuine, real deal medieval pubs. They're all inns. So there were ale houses which served ale to travellers and the like. We don't have any of those surviving. They had taverns which catered for serving wine to elite audiences. There's some of those buildings surviving, but none of them, crucially, are pubs any longer.
Oh, right. Okay.
And then there are the inns, which are a bit like big hotels. They have great big gate portals and courtyards for gathering. In the early modern period, plays are put on within them. Shakespeare acts in quite a number of them. They have the usual domestic arrangements of service passage with services on one side, great hall and parlours beyond, but there's multiple parlours for private dining and drinking in. There's shops at the front. They're urban. You don't find them in the provinces, and they're on the main drag through the town, often near the gates. And then up above, they're quite high buildings, and they have galleries around, open-sided galleries, and from stair turrets leading up to those galleries, you've then got rooms, and they can hold often several hundred people. And then out the back, you might find stables and storage and the like, something like that. So there are these medieval inns, and there's a small number of them that survive. A good example would be the New Inn at Gloucester, which dates to 1432. And we've got the stylistic dating of the archaeology there. We've got the dendro dating, which tells us 1432. And we've also got archival references to it in use as an inn by the 1450s. And it was operated by Gloucester Abbey as a commercial going enterprise to cater for merchants, drovers, pilgrims, travellers, elite households and the like. But there's only about 12 of these pubs, maybe 15, which are still operational in the country.
So really sort of late medieval, really, then. Yeah, so not even, certainly nowhere near the Crusades or the Dark
No,
Ages or what used to be called the Dark Ages or anything like that.
no, nothing like that. And I could only find one, possibly two, which predated 1400. So most of those that I've just referred to, like the New Inn at Gloucester, are 15th century in date.
Right.
The Bull Hotel in Ludlow, the front range there, which unfortunately was badly damaged by fire in the 18th century, there's a bit of that that looks like it's 14th century in date. And then the rest of it, the back rear range, the surviving rear range, is 15th century. But the front range, if it was built as a pub, and I'm not absolutely certain that it was, but if it was, that front range would be later 14th century. So that one needs some dendrochronology.
We focus mostly on pubs, which is a great subject to focus on, and everybody should go to pubs because they're very important places.
Mm.
I've drunk at the old trip to Jerusalem, and that was fun, and visiting the castle. I haven't travelled to some of the older ones as well, but that's good. To finish off, do you have a sort of favourite myth that you think is the most deserving of debunking, or one that you just find the most attractive from all of the ones that
Yeah,
we haven't yet talked about?
broadly I do, but broadly speaking, I kind of have three. So we've talked about the spiral staircase story. That I particularly enjoyed looking at because it surprised me that I was able to kind of point to the guy that invented it. I thought it'd be kind of like, it would be a more general
Yeah.
debunking with that one, but actually to be able to go and look at the guy's face, Theodore Cook's face, in a photograph and think, well, wow, this came out of your biography, this came out of your life, was amazing. The pub thing has also been great because you asked me, do I know which is the oldest? Well, I think it's the George Inn at Norton St Philip, which is in Somerset. It's about 6 miles to the south of Bath. So I've been able to sort of, again, point the finger there as well, using evidence, using the material culture, using the archives, using the dendrochronology to be able to actually say, well, I can't find a pub that is older than this one. It dates to about 1370, 1380, somewhere in that bracket. And I can't find anything earlier that's still a pub. I do know of one that is older, but it's not a pub anymore. So that one doesn't really count. So to be able to, again, sort of be as confident as you possibly can do, given the nature of the evidence, that here's the man who invented the spiral stairs and here's the oldest pub. The other thing that I've really enjoyed looking at, and I've only briefly alluded to in our chat, is the ship timber story. And this is a really common one. It's rare to be able to sort of go to a timber frame building and for at least one person to not start sort of slapping the timbers and saying, oh, this came out of a mighty warship that fought against the French or the Spanish. It's pretty rare for that story to not be communicated. But what I liked about the debunking of the ship timber story, firstly, you know, we know that 99% of those stories are utter rubbish, but there are a very, very minutely tiny amount of times where we do actually have ship timbers in historic buildings. And that realization, that's the only one of the 9 myths that I bust in the book where there is a tiny grain of truth to it. And in May of 23, I got asked to go and survey a cottage in Whitby, 45 Cliff Street. It's a holiday let, so you can go and have a look at this yourself if you pay a few quid to stay there. And it had 4 reused ship timbers in it, or large boat or small ship timbers. It had what are called futtocks, and they're the structural ribs of the keel of a ship. And they were massive section, way bigger than the lintels and brackets and collars that they were now in the building, way bigger than that were necessary. They were absolutely riddled with pegs and peg holes that were not doing anything at all structurally within the building. And the pegs that did survive were absolutely huge. There was no need for them to be 3 and 4 times the size of the pegs that you would find in a normal timber frame building. So all of this was kind of screaming something weird going on here. And I contacted my friend Damien Goodburn, who's a carpenter and a specialist in both terrestrial carpentry, but also medieval boat building. And I showed him these photographs and he came straight back and said, absolutely no doubt, these have come out of a ship. But when you think about the context of it, 45 Cliff Street looks straight down into Whitby Harbour. And Whitby Harbour, of course, has its famous ship building and breaking history. So it's possibly not too much of a stretch to imagine some timbers being hiked up down from the harbour and installed into this cottage, probably in the 18th or 19th century. So sometimes it does happen. So those are really my favourite stories.
Yeah, that's quite fun because, it's sort of sometimes there is a kernel of truth, and there are buildings made of ship's timbers, but they're tiny number, and then that myth has got sort of permeated out, and
Yeah.
people claim it for themselves. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. We could have kept talking for a good few hours because you said 9. There are
9
9.
chapters, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I've covered a few of them here. So what's the name of the book? Who publishes it, and how is it available?
So it's called Historic Building Myth Busting. It's been published very kindly by the History Press, who are based in Cheltenham, and it's available via all the usual online outlets, both good and bad booksellers. And you can find out more information about the book and myself and my research via triskellyheritage.com. And I'm currently in the very early stages of the second leg of the book tour as well. So I'm trotting up and down the country. Between June 24 and the end of May 25, I will have completed over 100 dates on the tour.
So how do people find out where you're going to be talking?
Again, on my website, there's a tab for the tour, and they can find out those dates there as well. And I'm doing everywhere from Edinburgh to Pevensey and Plymouth to Norwich, with Jersey and Ohio, USA thrown in for good measure as well.
Wonderful. My goodness, you're traveling across the pond. That's probably something worth thinking about, because we're talking about some of these pubs only being from the 18th century. And of course, that's incredibly old by some US standards. And then I would imagine in other places in the world that have been settled for, a long time, I would imagine places like Constantinople or Rome have some incredibly old places, but that's a whole other area of investigation perhaps one day.
Yeah, I think that's one for somebody else. I have a recurring nightmare that I wake up and I'm a Romanist. So that's one for my colleagues that do like all things Roman. That's not for me.
Well, it's been absolutely wonderful chatting to you. Good luck with the book tour and the book. I look forward to talking to you again. Hopefully we can make time for another one of these.
I'd love to. Thanks very much for having me on the podcast, Jason. It's been a real privilege.